Hello, my name is Jenica Webster. I know most of the people in this room. I am the incoming director of the Institute for Women's Leadership and an associate professor of management in the College of Business. Before I introduce this incredible panel, I want to welcome everybody to the very first IWL event of the semester. At the IWL, we are dedicated to raising awareness and speaking to some of the most pressing issues that women and women leaders face today. I'm really honored that we have such a highly esteemed panel and moderator here with us to talk about a critical and influential piece of legislation that was passed 50 years ago. And if you're like me, I had to count this morning. So that was in 1972, Title IX of the Civil Rights Act was passed. So this panel will take a critical and cross-disciplinary lens and share with us a historical perspective and impact of this legislation and speak to the opportunities and challenges that lie ahead. So let me first introduce this incredible panel. So I'm going to start with Megan Duffy. So she is the head coach of Marquette's women's basketball team. She has the best winning percentage of any coach in Marquette women's basketball history. Prior to Marquette, Megan was a 4-year letter winner at Notre Dame. She played in the WNBA and overseas, and she also won a gold medal with USA Basketball. That's pretty impressive. She did ask me to play her in a game of one-on-one later. I'm pretty good. Next we have Kristen Kreppel. So she has served as Marquette's Title IX coordinator for the last 4 years. She's a University of Wisconsin law graduate. We won't hold anything against her for that, who gained her civil rights expertise at the Department of Education Office for Civil Rights, and then in Stanford University's Title IX office. So next is Professor Callie Murray. She's a professor of law at Marquette University Law School. Her research is focused on the politics of participation in patent, property, and administrative law. That is a mouthful and impressive. She is also a co-director of Marquette University Law School's Intellectual Property Program. So welcome, Callie. And finally, let me welcome Professor Jeff Ramsey. So Jeff is currently working as the Senior Director of Student Services at Herzing University Online and is also an adjunct history professor at Southern New Hampshire University. Jeff earned his PhD in modern U.S. history at Marquette, so he's an alum. His research examined the response from university athletic departments and university leadership in the Big Ten Athletic Conference in the decade following the passage of Title IX. So welcome, Jeff. And to our moderator, Dr. Chris Naviak. So Chris is our incoming Vice President for Inclusive Excellence and leader of the Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion. In that role, she leads the charge of promoting a more equitable and inclusive campus community. And prior to joining Marquette, Chris held key leadership positions within the University of Wisconsin System Administration, advancing their efforts in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So welcome. Now I'm going to hand it over to Chris, who will moderate the discussion, and then we're going to open it up to audience questions later in the program.
I'm going to operate from here. I'm short, and so I hope you can all see me rather than stand at the podium. We're going to try and do this a little bit more conversational, okay? We've talked about this conversation. We're going to hit 3 main topics today. So first, we're going to start with the history of Title IX, so everybody just has a really good basic understanding of what it is. Then we'll move into the impacts of it. What difference has it made in the lives of women and others across colleges and universities, whether that's in the athletic landscape or beyond. And then we're going to think about the path forward, right? As we think about tomorrow and the days after, what do we need to be thinking about in terms of Title IX? What challenges should we be considering, right? So I'm going to start off. I've got questions for each of the panelists. To the panelists, if you want to jump in and add something, please feel free to do that. If you want to expound on an idea, we're happy to do this. This is really meant to be as conversational as we can possibly make it. So for the first question, it's going to go to you, Kristen. Broadly speaking, what is Title IX and what does it cover?
Yeah, so Title IX is a federal civil rights law, prohibits discrimination based on sex in any educational setting that accepts any federal funding. And it's just one sentence. So the entirety of the law that we're working from is just 37 words. And what it looks like has changed a lot over the years, from a focus on equity in athletics to including sexual harassment and sexual assault. So it's really an evolving 37 words, but that's where we've started.
Jeff, you've looked at the history of Title IX. Tell us a little bit about the initial response from colleges and universities when this law was first passed.
Yeah, absolutely. So my focus really was, as Kristen said, it's bigger than athletics, but my focus was primarily on athletics. And as she said, it's 37 words, but the devil's in the details, as we all know. And so when the law was first passed, most colleges were like, oh, yeah, okay, that sounds good, great, we'll support women. But then it started getting into more of this is how you need to do it, and this is what you need to do. And you had a lot of colleges that were responding, at least in my research, with I'm not sexist, but you can't tell me what to do. And that was the response that a lot of the colleges gave to and fought against any new regulations that came in, that the OCR, the Office of Civil Rights and the Department of Ed, what they started implementing. So that was a big kind of hurdle to overcome, I think, initially, is that type of resistance. I'm not sexist, but that resistance was sort of the response. From an athletic standpoint, the colleges and universities I looked at, a lot of it was driven by those, what we would call maybe today revenue sports, football and men's basketball. If they had a good program there, they were a lot more resistant to the women. If they didn't, they kind of were looking for something to hang their hats on and really responded a lot more favorably to add women's programs. The last thing I'll say, I think is important to note as well, about the history when it first passed, at least from an athletic standpoint, is prior to Title IX, I don't know that, especially my generation or younger generation, we picture what women's athletics was like prior to Title IX. We're talking about basically club sports. They were doing car washes and bake sales to raise money just to go from Indiana to Purdue to play a game against another school, right? And some places they didn't have all the sports. And it went from essentially, I'm not gonna say zero, but very minimal to now all of a sudden it's funded. Not all of a sudden because there was resistance, but it's funded, there's university support. And a side note that may or may not come up later, but you had a very female women-driven organization with women's sports called the AIAW, that they in some ways fought against Title IX because they were worried of losing their power to the NCAA, which eventually they did. So there's trade-offs, right? We saw a huge increase in women's athletic participation, but a reduction in the control that women had over their athletics. So that's another just sort of random piece to it. But again, the resistance was very much I'm not sexist, but don't tell me what to do. Stay out of my life, government was kind of the way that it
Callie, you get the next question. How are we to understand Title IX from the perspective of intersectionality?
Well, I think the first thing to understand that Title IX is actually the end of a very important intersectional movement in American politics that started with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which said that no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, national origin, be excluded from educational settings that receive federal funding. So Title VI was always an important part and I think parcel of Title IX, right? Very often, I think we do not examine university compliance requirements around Title VI. And you have to see Title VI and Title IX as being together from the beginning. We also have Title VII, and Title VII is an earlier act that prevents discrimination in employment around sex. So you have to see Title VI, Title VII, and Title IX together. So I think the legal framework is always understood to be an intersectional framework. And I sort of think it's important to understand who was one of the primary authors of the movement towards Title VI, Title VII, and Title IX. It was a African-American woman, although she later identified as, or in her private life, I would say, identified differently on the gender spectrum. It was an African-American woman named Polly Murray, and also ran with my cousin, but Polly Murray, she wrote in a very important memorandum that was circulated throughout Congress during Title VII that also became the grounds for Title IX, that looked at the different types of ways in which women experience discrimination based on sex. And so she's very often, I think, ignored in how we understand and think about Title VI, Title VII, and Title IX. There's a really good Amazon Prime documentary on here right now that people might want to take a look at, looking for an accessible way into her work. But she wrote a very early important law review article with a co-author, and she came up with a word called Jane Crow, right? She said we have to see discrimination in African-American women experience in light of their intersection, right? So I think Kimberly Crenshaw is usually understood to come up with the term intersectional, but Polly Murray was writing about that work in the late 60s. And she's also very important advisor to Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the types of cases that Ruth Bader Ginsburg brought throughout the 70s. So when you look at the history of Title IX, I do think it's very important to place it in the efforts of feminism generally. I think it's very important to also place it within the context of the civil rights movement and the ways in which the civil rights movement and the women's movement. And then I think it's very important to place it in the bodies of people, right? That's who experiences Title IX. And it's very, I think, helpful to understand that it was always intended to be an intersectional act and have intersectional impact.
Picking up on the notion of experiences, right? Megan, tell us a little bit about how you think Title IX has played out in your career and potentially in the lives of young women you coach.
Absolutely. I mean, to keep it simple, Title IX changed my life. You know, we talked about how it sometimes goes directly to the athletics world, but the word opportunity comes to my mind. And just as a youth and a young girl, to be able to try any sport I wanted to, before my parents put me in the funding to do it. And I know people talk about the skills that you build as an elementary school kid or as a middle school young girl. And it wasn't about the gender of being soft or weak, or you need to be in this place or this position. It was about being strong and being confident, learning how to interact with, you know, teammates and the camaraderie. And obviously that builds on from the youth stage all the way up. And, you know, for me to be able to receive, fast forward, a full athletic scholarship and academic scholarship to go to Notre Dame and play for one of the most famous college basketball coaches we have, the lessons, the opportunities to travel the world, the country, for a simple 37-word law is pretty amazing. And I think situations like that propelled me into even thinking about going into teaching and coaching as a profession, because I could do it, I could see it. You know, if you follow the athletics world, Serena Williams just retired not too long ago, but it's figures like that who would have never happened if it wasn't for this, you know, law that passed 50 years ago. So it's inspiring for me every day. It's a reason, as simple as it is, that I wake up in the morning to have that opportunity to teach and inspire the people around me. And just the fact that you're learning these life lessons and these skills, that I can sit in front of this group, I can, you know, lead a team, you know, give my thoughts and opinions, and it's not looked down upon. It's actually welcomed, and it's an inspiring notion to tell my players and these student athletes that you can get there, you can do this through athletics, but then obviously that correlates into what they want to do down the road with their own families, with their professions. And by far, it's something that has significantly changed my life.
What about your players? Do you think they really understand sort of the impact of this, or is it just now become so everyday that, you know, it maybe doesn't kind of break through their consciousness.
Yeah, I think our players see inequities every day. I
Yeah.
think they see it no matter where they go, so we don't hide from that. But when you give the whole education of, even what my college coach was doing, driving the van and, making the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and, we got one pair of shoes for, the next year or so to, maybe my generation of, we got to jump on maybe a charter flight once a year to now here at Marquette, it's something we do very regularly. And, those simple things, I think it's part of our job as leaders to teach them, how far we've come, obviously, and them understanding, and it wasn't even a lot about sports. It was about education. So for example, we have an engineering major, and I go, do you realize, 50 years ago, you would have been rejected to come to Marquette or a different institution if you wanted to be an engineer? It wouldn't have happened. In their world, in their social media world, and a little instant gratification, they're thinking about shoes and I'm going to make it through practice. But when you give them that education, it's something we pride ourselves on to do that, see the bigger picture of things and how that statement of, man, we've come such a long way, and it's inspiring each decade how it changes and evolves, but there's still a long way to go.
Jeff, I'm gonna go back to you for a little bit, and let's talk about, can you expound a little bit more on some of the reactions, the challenges, initial challenges?
Well, this conversation is fascinating because we talk about intersectionality. We see, I think the popular consciousness of Title IX is it's sports, but it was so intersected. The resistance was exactly the same resistance you saw to busing. It was exactly the same resistance you saw to the ERA. It's the exact same resistance you saw to LGBTQ rights. All of that, where it was, I guess the nicest way to put it is I support women. I have a wife at home. I don't hate women, but I don't want them to infringe on my territory, right? That sports is a male territory. I don't want women, or engineering, or all of these other things are a male territory, and we don't want that infringement. Part of it also came into logistical concerns of, as I said, it went from sometimes in many cases, even at big schools, zero funding from the university to now all of a sudden we've got to create an entire women's program that we didn't support before. How are we going to do that? Is that going to take away from, again, the big money sports, the football, the basketball, the men's basketball? And so there was some of that going on, of that really pushback, and athletic directors, coaches, university presidents are going to Congress and lobbying against all of the new regulations coming out from the OCR, and in a way, again, we see it today. Even I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but it's that concept of, historically speaking, a rights-based rhetoric. You're taking my rights away, sort of looking at it as one pie, and if you give more to women, then it's automatically taking things away from men. And that's not what the law is intended to do. That's not what the regulations are intended to do. But that was the reaction that you saw, that I saw in my research from a lot of different folks, that this is, if you add this sport, you're going to take away some of my rights. And it's interesting. I got into the research. I was interested in it from a gender perspective. I actually wanted to see how male athletes responded. Like, this is my territory, and now women are coming in. But it really quickly turned into that administrative look of that, and yeah.
So it was really treated like a zero-sum game.
It was.
In many respects, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Which
If you
is non-common.
Yeah, if you add this women's swimming team, that means we have less scholarships for football or basketball, and I stopped my research around the mid 80s, and that was in the 80s was where you started seeing a lot of, all right, well, we got to equalize, so we're going to cut men's wrestling, and we're going to have a 200-person women's crew team, and we're going to cut men's sports to equalize, because it was easier for athletic departments to do that. And again, still even then treating it as that zero-sum game.
Kristen, thinking again about this notion of impact, if we go beyond, we move beyond athletics, can you tell us a little bit more about what other groups the law covers and what it does for them?
Yeah, so the beauty of those 37 words is that they're not prescriptive, right? They can be applied in a lot of different ways, and they have been applied in a lot of different ways through OCR, the Office for Civil Rights Guidance, and also from court precedent. So I always go back to thinking of the godmother of Title IX. Her name was Bunny Sandler, and she really got the ball rolling on this piece of legislation because she had her PhD and she was applying to tenure track positions in the late 60s, and she was not getting any traction while all these men around her were getting jobs quite easily. And she started asking around, like, what's going on? Why am I not getting these opportunities? And she was told, well, you know, you're not taking care of a family, and you come on too strong for a woman. So nothing about her credentials at all. And so she really got the ball rolling. And I always think of that as a reminder that Title IX is not just athletics, it's not just students, it covers faculty and staff. You know, are we seeing equity in pay? Are we seeing equity in opportunities? It covers admissions. It covers students who are pregnant or newly parenting. We want a student who is faced with that to be able to stay on track as much as possible. So we need to give that student the opportunities to have accommodations that are reasonable, to take a leave if they need to and come back and be in the same position so they don't lose ground. More recently, the Biden administration has made clear that Title IX covers folks who, based on their sexual orientation or gender identity, that's all covered under the umbrella of sex discrimination. So, and it's evolving. There are court cases all the time that deal with different aspects of Title IX, but I think that the really important thing to keep in mind is that it really is all encompassing and can go in so many different directions.
Great. Okay, now we want to shift a little bit and start thinking ahead, right, into the future. So, Callie, from the perspective of the law, what do you see as some of the major challenges to Title IX moving forward?
So I have on my notes, monetization of the educational landscape. Which means things like the NCAA now has to recognize name, likeness, student athletes, right? So what does it mean in the Title IX context to think about name and likeness? And there was like a really interesting moment. I was watching an ESPN documentary on the first sort of the women's basketball Olympic team from the 1990s having to try on dresses, right? Dawn Staley was trying on a dress, and it was like watching somebody be forced right into a dress. It was a painful moment. I think everybody in the documentary was like, oh, you know, when they made us go into the store and buy dresses, and then everybody yelled at us because we didn't look feminine enough. And I was like, guys, that's actually a fairly painful moment, but you know, we handle our situations the way we handle them. And I was thinking about that within the context of Title IX. So like, what does it mean? What type of advice if you're advising a student about name and likeness? Like, how do you advise a student? Do you say there are certain type of images that you want to present in order to make you more friendly, right, to advertising? How do you handle that situation, right? And so as college athletics moves beyond, you know, the athletic department to helping students have to confront issues outside of the university, that's going to be a fraught moment because we have to think, I think, very hard about what kind of advice we give and how do we address sort of social stereotyping in athletics. The next place is, I think, Kimo's probably going to hate me on this, we're going to need more lawyers. It's going to get complicated, guys, but what has happened, I think a practical impact of Title IX for universities, it's meant that for the most part, universities are moving towards athletic directors who have legal backgrounds because the types of issues that they confront are significant, both from a Title IX perspective and I would argue from a Title VI perspective, and that they need people who are able to manage the environment differently. And when I teach administrative law in law school, I call it compliance environments, where you're not a lawyer in the traditional sense, right? You're not going into court or you're not writing a contract per se, but you're leading a community through very difficult conversations and difficult policy choices. So your environment is completely different. And I think, you know, when we think about the stereotypical athletic department director, right? In the old days, they were usually like the guy who's the best coach, right? That's not what's going to be happening anymore because we have to have somebody in that position who understands the kind of environment that they're going to have to operate in. And I think that's actually true for most parts of the modern university in ways that I think conflict with how we as universities can perceive our roles in society. So I say Title IX and Title VI and Title VII, they're changing sites, right? We think about them in a corporation, we don't necessarily think about them in a university, but I think that is changing. And then finally, I think managing the spectrum of identity. I mean, we have significant Title IX conflicts over what is gender, what is sex, who benefits or does not benefit from the scope of these programs. And I would say they're nested in the programs from the beginning. I mean, I think I think Pauli Murray being a paradigmic kind of person in this struggle sort of suggests all the ways in which these types of identities intersect. And that's actually really difficult for organizations to map, right? Organizations like very binary classifications, and we are moving past those types of binary classifications to really engaging with all the different ways in which individuals experience themselves and what are the consequences for institutions as they confront that set of choices. So again, I think what is magical about the law, you can do all that in 37 words, right? But I think when we started the journey of Title IX, we had a very static view of institutions. And now I think you actually have to have a very sort of complex, systemic way of thinking about how people relate to community in different types of settings. And I think Title IX is a law that achieved far more than it set out and intended to do.
And I know you're coming to me next, but I would add to what you're saying too. I think one of the ironies that I'm seeing in the current landscape is that a segment of the population who 50 years ago would have said women can't play sports are now standing up for their daughters to play sports, but they don't want transgender people to play, right? So it's an interesting kind of shift in that same, I want it to be very clear that men play sports, women don't. Now it's men and women play sports, but if you're transgender, that you can't be a part of a women's team, right? So it's just an interesting evolution in that. And so maybe 50 years from now, hopefully sooner than that, we're in a little bit better spot, so.
Megan, what do you see as some of the strides we still have to make moving forward?
I mentioned before that we have a great appreciation of how history has benefited many girls and women, and myself particularly. But we also want to, I think in athletics, to me, here on the university side, you want our student athletes to have a phenomenal experience first and foremost. That's what drives us every day, whatever the respective area is. In sports, there's also an entertainment side, and there's also that third piece of you're trying to make money too, in some form. And all these worlds colliding, and how does that fit into what Alex and Ryan are talking about? We have a system in place that for decades has supported a certain route. And I think while we say there's been some great strides, the time it's going to take to chip away, to build it and have leaders or representation that want to fight a little harder and have their voices that represent all people, it's not there yet. But what I can say even here, I have advocates that I don't get to hear in every conversation, but I know, Chemo here, Bill Schultz here today, Sarah, but there's people around that are fighting for my women. And the more we can be those people as we're teaching, we're learning, you're in a conversation, to keep pushing the envelope is so important. I referenced Serena before. When Kobe Bryant passed, the hashtag Girl Dad came out so much, and it was about kind of what you said, that we want these dads to now support their daughters, but I would love to have a world that it's not just because you have a daughter. You don't see it until you have a daughter. It's men supporting men's sports, women's sports, women support, it's obviously that perfect world, but the more, a younger coach like me in this business can, talk the talk and back it up and not afraid to stand up and have conversations. I think there's always, if you complain too much or you give your opinion too much, you're going to look upon differently. And I think the more us younger leaders can come up and be confident and, our opinions and the information to back it up and why it's important, we hope that trickle down effect will begin to make some change, each decade we move forward with it.
So for all the folks in the back, particularly those of you who are men, we need your support, right? We need your allyship for calling you in. That was a great invitation, Megan. I really appreciate it.
Can I jump
Yeah,
in
jump
just real
in.
quick? So I mentioned at the outset when I was first talking about AIAW, and this was an all-female led organization that monitors sort of like a NCAA, but for the women's sports. That leadership went away when NCAA sort of took over, right? When Title IX passed, that was a loss. I think we're now getting to the point where we have people like Megan who are leading a college basketball team that wouldn't have maybe had that opportunity. When I was in college, I played sports and all of my athletic directors were women, right? So more and more seeing the leadership, I think, is a big step forward, kind of almost coming back to how it was pre-Title IX in terms of female leadership. And I think that's a big direction that we want to take, and more of the athletes that are playing now moving into coaching positions and athletic director positions, that sort of thing.
Kristen, if we think about the future for Marquette, what are some of the emerging trends, do you think, that we need to keep our eye on and to keep track of? Things that we need to just, again, keep sort of monitoring?
Yeah, it's Title IX is such a different world than when I was in school. Schools had to have Title IX coordinators for decades now, but at least I know when I was growing up, I had no idea that we had one at our school. I had no idea who they were. It was really a name only. They had at least one other job on campus. And now, Title IX is also a thing at K through 12 schools. So we've got students who are coming to Marquette knowing Title IX, knowing a little bit more about what resources and rights are available to them. And so what I'm really seeing from my office is students being a lot more proactive, coming to me before issues get worse. It allows us to improve environments before we have to do something formal like an investigation. And of course, the Title IX office does do formal investigations, but what we are seeing is that that's not always the way that someone can be helped. Sometimes it's not the best way. And so what I'm seeing is that folks are starting to see Title IX more as a resource and a collaborator on campus than a compliance office, which I want us to be both. And so, I think folks are getting more comfortable coming to the Title IX office for advice, talking hypotheticals, because no matter what the issue is that someone is running into, the bottom line is when something Title IX related is happening, it can make it really hard for someone to work or learn. And that's why Title IX should be here. That's the work that we need to do on campus. And so I think we need to turn our attention to, not just focusing on students, but also on faculty and staff. I want all folks to know that Title IX is for them as part of the university community. We are seeing more students who identify as trans on campus, and I want to make sure that those folks feel supported and know that, if they face discrimination or harassment based on their identity, that they can come to us. I think the biggest thing I would say is that our populations are shifting, and they are more vocal and willing to get that help and to work with us, which has been a really great shift.
Now it's time to open, I think, Kendra, can we open it up to
Yeah,
questions?
absolutely.
From
Yeah.
from the audience?
So if we could take some questions from the audience, I'm happy to come around with the microphone. If people have questions for our wonderful panel.
Go first. Oh gosh, that's really good. Okay, I know you mentioned that Megan, like you played overseas and the rest of you go very deep in Title IX history and everything. I know that I had a lot of teammates in college that actually ended up like afterwards went and played overseas for hockey or whatever it was. But I guess, do you guys know, is this a problem overseas too, or is it just so normalized elsewhere that it's not a topic of conversation in Europe or wherever? Yeah.
So, I think the best way to look at it is we're actually a model for other countries. Like I was at my son's soccer practice, hashtag boy mom. And, I was at my son's soccer practice, and I was like sitting with to a woman who was from I think Colombia, and we were talking about soccer, and I like went into it. I was like, okay, yeah, I was playing in like 1993 in America, in Columbia, Maryland, and and she's looking at me like I'm a really big soccer fan. And the World Cup, I'm excited about Qatar, and she's like, we as women in Colombia aren't talking about soccer the way we just talked about soccer. That we didn't have an experience of Title IX in other countries. Now, I think what's shifted in both basketball and in soccer is that if you are a pro right now, you want to go to Europe as in either of those, the Saint Germain teams. So at a professional level, it's sort of interesting. At an amateur level, I would say the United States is a model, and we really should understand Title IX as being a formative political experience for women in the United States. I think y'all don't know what it's like not to be equal. And I think that's a really powerful moment. Like, you grow up expecting this to be your reality. And I certainly think when I was born in 1975, and playing sports in the 1980s and 1990s, it was not the same experience that you have now. And like we didn't have the kind of experience that our male athlete friends did. But almost all of my friends who went to law school, all of us had played high school sports. We did track, we did soccer. Like but it was sort of unspoken that this was a formative experience for us. Like, I was in law school, I had a lot of girlfriends. If you looked at all our commonalities, we all had played sports in one way or the other. But I do think we face in America the challenge of professional sports, right? Which is that when you aren't, I think a lot about Brittany Griner right now, because she's in Russia playing professional sports, because we do not subsidize men and women equally in professional sports. And I think I look at Europe and I wonder why in Europe there's been a more willingness to actually pay women for the work that they do in professional sports. Because right now in the WNBA, we are not paying women equitably. Like, if it was an organization, like, we'd have to do a pay equity report, and it would be real ugly. And we actually were looking at men's sports and women's sports. And I think it forecloses opportunities. Like, why do we have amazing experiences for women, and then they turn 26 and are like, okay, well, career over, goodbye. And I think we have to ask ourselves, why is that? Why are we not taking the promise of Title IX into a professional sport?
I know for me, I had the opportunity to play overseas professionally and in the WNBA. So summertime in the WNBA, and then you'd go over to Europe. And we all made that decision. You kind of didn't know any better. You went because you're like, oh, you're going to get paid 2 to 3 times more money than you ever would in the WNBA. That's a very true statement. So yes, you get the experience of living in a different country and the culture and experiencing that. As a student athlete at the college level, you don't often get to experience that because of the demands of your sport. But we knew it was about the competition, but it was about getting paid. Like, you got paid more than the WNBA. Now, things have changed significantly with the WNBA. That enhancements are incredible right now and through the roof relative to where it was at. There's no obviously comparison between the NBA and WNBA, but that's why we went. Now, how we, just a little insight to how we got paid on those overseas teams, it was all corporate dollars. It was all sponsorships. And that was a huge piece of it if you were making, a significant salary over there. And then, we tease it with a little bit about the money too, but then there was also those sport foundations, because university and sport is it's different. There's a big separation. As we try and integrate it, it's very separate over there. So even government dollars would go towards my salary. So a little bit different, but yeah, a lot of it was about money.
I can say, looking at Title IX more broadly in the university setting, there really is no Title IX like law at any other school that I'm aware of. So when we have students who are studying abroad here, those are really challenging trainings that we do because they don't have that framework that our students coming from the United States have. So.
Well, I was just going to piggyback off of that a little bit. I know like throughout college, a lot of like my friends, like teammates or other teammates of like friends and stuff on different sports, whatever, it was, a lot of them were like from overseas. It was kind of, I don't know if this is bad to say, but we call them like the import site, because you were only allotted, especially in like hockey, is when you're playing junior hockey, for men's or women, you're only allotted like 5 people from out of this country to come play for you, right? And so, but so many people were like trying to come here because at universities overseas, there is like no sports. Like you come to the States, if you want to play sports in college. I mean, even Canada, especially. I went to Twin Cities, so there's a lot of Canadian hockey players on my team. But yeah, it just doesn't seem like it exists overseas. So I don't know if professionally is any different.
So I have a quick question. So we've talked a lot about sports in Title IX. I'm curious, could we expand a little bit about other protections that Title IX offers, and what potentially for you, Kristen, specifically, what is coming across your desk and other Title IX officers' desks around college campuses today? What do those look like? I mean, for me, I really get the sense from this, from this panel, what Title IX does in terms of equity in sports for women. But what else does it cover, and what are you seeing other than inequity in sports?
Yeah,
It's
so
like up to the panel. I'm sorry, there's like a lot of we have noise back there now. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Could we just?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Is that all right? Thank you.
okay, so our Title IX policy and schools across the country have very similar ones. There is a lot under the sexual harassment umbrella that is prohibited under Title IX. So, you've got hostile environment, sexual harassment. I would say that's what we most commonly see. We also prohibit quid pro quo, sexual harassment, and then stalking, dating and domestic violence, retaliation. All of those different prohibited behaviors fall under our Title IX policy. And so, and that can happen in the student space or in the employee space. And so, we work closely with HR, with other offices on campus to tackle those issues. But really that sexual harassment and sex discrimination piece is really the biggest piece that Title IX offices deal with at universities. So I would say, we see different things happening all year. It's every year is a little different, but this is a really busy time for students just getting to campus, and we call this the red zone. So there's a time when sexual harassment, sexual assault are more likely to happen when a student comes to campus. And so we are working on those issues at the start of the school year. And then, we've got faculty and staff coming to our office to talk about issues that they're facing in the course of their employment that may fall under Title IX. So it's really, so that's the kind of reactive work that we do. But then we also want to be proactive. So, we'll work with athletics and do prevention training, work with the residence halls to make sure that folks are trained on what Title IX is and how to react when something Title IX related happens. And, making sure our job on campus is to basically make sure that we are treating people equitably based on sex. And so that is all encompassing. And so we always want to be more proactive, but oftentimes we are reactive to different incidents that happen. Is that helpful?
That's perfect. Yeah, thank you. Other questions?
I'd like to kind of dovetail off that last question you asked, and kind of probe a little more deeply. As Title IX is evolving, and you talked about how the Biden administration is expanding how Title IX is defined to include identity, including transgender. To what level do you think the structure of how we organize the university with Title IX, do you feel empowered where you're at now? How do other universities involve Title IX with HR and with students and with, there's so many aspects to this.
It's a really good question that has a really big answer. I would say every school does it a little bit differently. Some Title IX offices are housed within HR. Sometimes they're in student affairs. Sometimes they're in the general counsel's office. A best practice is to have them within the president's office. Usually that's not tenable on a large university setting, but that's all to say that there's really no clear place for Title IX to be that makes sense, because we don't just serve students, we don't just serve staff, we serve everybody. And so what I want is to just be out there. I want folks to know that Title IX exists and how it exists at the university, and to be comfortable coming to my office, walking in if they are comfortable and working with me. So it's really just getting out there and making sure that folks in different departments know about the resources that we offer. And, I will say, yeah, the Biden administration has some proposed regulations that they released recently. So we're going through that notice and comment process of the Administrative Procedures Act, where anyone in the public can respond to those proposed regulations. And then we'll get some final regulations, but that's going to be a while. So we are still currently under the regulations that were put in place under the Trump administration. And those do not particularly mention sexual orientation or gender identity. And so it's up to each school to make sure that they are covering that, but it's not clear as to how we need to. And so it's sort of piecemeal at this point. What I always tell folks at Marquette is that, Title IX is a political football in a lot of ways, but we are always staying the course as much as we can. And we are always going to be a support resource for you. And so we try to stay the course and kind of keep that political noise outside as much as we can.
Hi, thank you very much for this really important information. I wanted to ask if there was collaboration between the Title IX office and other stakeholders, because different forms of discrimination or harassment might manifest differently in relation to people from different backgrounds. So an international student might experience it in different ways than a student who was aware of vetted in this kind of social environment.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And oftentimes when we see, discrimination based on sex, it's not existing in a bubble. It can be discrimination based on a lot of different protected categories. And so when those situations happen, our office does partner with HR, with student affairs, the student conduct office if we need to, whichever office makes sense. There is a movement on a lot of campuses to have all of those discrimination and harassment based on all of those protected categories to be under one umbrella. So people have kind of a one-stop that they can go to have a situation addressed from all of those different angles. I think it's something worth exploring, and I just want folks to know what routes they need to take to get an issue that happens fully reviewed and examined, and yeah.
First of all, thanks for being here. I'm so excited. Because when I went through, I started my soccer team at my high school, and my daughter, she started soccer when it never occurred to her not to have one. So I think that's great progress. So in the concept of progress, you are all working with college students. How are you preparing them to go out in the workforce where they might experience different prejudices? I mean, what's your vision for these students to be prepared to go out into the world after college? Anybody wants to answer?
Well, I teach law, right? So I prepare them for what Kristen's doing, which is I think, Title IX builds collaboration. I think at its core, it's collaborative effort between folks throughout communities. So as a lawyer, you don't actually get trained a lot in collaboration. The classes that I teach on race and diversity, and I talk a lot about you have to approach stakeholders much differently when you do this work, because it is a different kind of work. So from a practical standpoint, I prepare my students for collaboration. I think from a standpoint of being a woman of color, often being a pioneer in that field, I teach my students a lot about resilience, right? Which is people are gonna say some crazy things, people are gonna do some crazy things in your life, right? And I think what I learned, I mean, I always say feminism taught me two things. The first thing it taught me was to know that some of what was happening to me was systemic. So I didn't blame myself. I was like, wow, like this lawyer just called me his nanny. Okay, I gotta think on that. What I would think often was, thank God I'm a feminist because it explains what just happened to me. And then I can, like, and then I would have to ask myself, do I want my organization to change? Or do I myself as an individual, can I confront this and have the resources in my life to build this kind of work? I mean, I think what I get nervous about with students a lot is that, like, we have a lot of conversations about what goes wrong around race and gender and identity, and we don't have a lot of conversations about what we can do to make it better and how they can build resiliency in front of the situation. Because I always have a story. I had very, as you could probably guess, peppery grandma. And one time I was telling her about microaggression. She's like, look, you know, in the 40s, there was a lot of aggression. And she's like, I understand microaggressions. I understand it. You know, sometimes like work, people don't like it. She's like, yeah, I can't even get to work, you know, like that. Like, it's just like when I was pregnant, they would just fire me for 9 months, and then I would go back and be teachers. And so she's like, hey, you know, put things in perspective, right? And so I think for me, I very often say to students, things can go wrong because we are human and because we are people. And systems can operate to oppress you because, again, systems run on their own without a lot of thinking. But if you're resilient and you can be creative in how you think about these set of choices, then you can confront those choices in healthy ways. Because I think the one thing that happens is sometimes we don't confront these types of conflicts in healthy ways. And I will say, I think that's what athletics taught me. Like, being a sports person was like, you get up, you get smacked in the head with the ball. I was a really bad goalie, so I'd smack in the head with the ball, and I would get up and I'd have to figure it out. And so I always used to say, like, I was always a believer in Title IX, you know, like, because I understood what the sports context brought me, what having women professors in law school taught me, was that having different people in spaces that were once exclusive really changes the nature of the space. And I think I always think that's what Title IX's great achievement was. It said, first, you're welcome into the space, and if we are providing opportunity, we have to provide that opportunity. And let people do what they can with that equality of opportunity.
Good, thank you so much. I love that. Thank you. One last question.
Jennifer, can I wrap like 2 questions into one? Thank you, panel. I'll just echo this whole room is just, we all are just like giddy just to be here and to witness everything you guys are saying. 2 pieces of the question. The first part is kind of a little bit more sports related. I'm trying to understand the intentionality around things like, and I'll tell a story. So my sister-in-law was made the Dutch women's national lacrosse team this past summer. They played in the World Cup, which was held in Maryland, and ESPN broadcast every single game of this 32-team tournament. You know, women's lacrosse at the professional level. And I thought to myself, something is obviously changing that an organization like ESPN is saying we want to promote more women's sports viewing for anybody in the country. I watch every game on ESPN. I thought it was crazy. Related to that, when I think about sports, I'm curious. The question actually goes to the U.S. Women's National Soccer Team and the equal pay that just was passed. Question 1 is, how is that kind of impacting other things? Is that a really big moment, or is that an incremental step? And the second part of the question is, we've talked about some of the things that are happening in other countries. This isn't just sports related, but are there other countries, not just like paying, for example, women's basketball players, maybe what they deserve, obviously, but what is happening in other countries that we could learn from in the United States that kind of is that bellwether, or are we kind of that leader on a world basis, you know, from that standpoint?
Well, I'll jump in and just make a guess to the first part of the question. I think looking at the past and kind of connecting to your question, the resistance was around, at least stated resistance, right? I don't want to discount the sexism that was there, but stated resistance was, we can't afford it, we can't do that. So the dollar speaks, right? They played 32 games or however many games of lacrosse is because they thought people would watch it, right? And more people are watching it, and you had a personal connection, so you watched it. If a dad has a daughter that's playing, right, there's more of those eyes, and I think women's national team in soccer, they're probably more popular than the men's team because they've had more success and all of that. So I think a lot of it, not to be the capitalist of the group, but it comes down to the dollar, and if people are going to put their eyeballs on it, there's going to be changes that can happen, and it's hard to. Yeah, that's kind of where I'd go with that particular one.
And what we're seeing with women's sports, collegiate pros, that we're making some big strides on the media side. I mean, the WNBA finals just ended, and it was the largest viewing audience in I don't know how many years. And we're trying to make the U.S. women's national soccer team not just a moment, but it's building momentum for the next sport. Even with the NCAA, we're having sellout crowds now and pro arenas. Are we able to be in a football stadium right now? No, but if you get more opportunities like that, that's when ESPN is calling and wants to make a different kind of deal, and it just starts building. So there is some great progress. It's micro, it feels like, on some levels, but I can tell you from our specific sport and just the pro side on the women's game, it's growing and people do want to watch it, and the opportunities to put it on. We all struggle when spike balls on and you can put a women's basketball game on. But again, I think you can laugh and joke about that, but we are making some significant strides with the media attention.
And some of that comes down to the current generation and social media. And if everybody remembers, I think it was pre-pandemic, there was a video taken by an Oregon women's basketball player at the shoddy weight room compared to what the men had during the tournament. And that was a student athlete just saying, this is crappy, let me show the world it. And it took off, and there were attempts to make some improvements in the next year. So that impacts this one.
That's a whole other panel.
Yes.
A whole other thing. I would say hashtag, the reason why it's a hashtag going on is because I actually think, like my when I go to my son's soccer team, his coaches now are 2 women, right? So he's sitting there and he's like, this is again a world in which he grows up, and it's totally okay that his women, they know what they're doing. He doesn't know what he's doing. And so I think, I think the thing about equality is that it's a positive, right? And a lot of times when we talk about equality, we think about that pie, right? It turns out, we're universities, we're not pie makers, right? Having people come in, it changes not just men and women, it changes us all, right? So you just get to the point where you think some of this is normal, right? And I think that's what's happening. It's actually just normal to watch women's sports, right? I like lacrosse in both versions, right? So I watch lacrosse in both versions. And there are different things I like about going to a men's basketball game and a women's basketball. I can think about the difference, but because the equality has happened, I can think about the difference and what it makes. The other thing I would say, I have traveled a lot in my life, and what I always come away with is I'm really proud of American women. Because when I go to other cultures, the stuff that we were doing, that stuff that Bunny was doing, right, was changing how women operate in the world. So one of the reasons why more people watching Women's World Cup soccer has nothing to do with Americans teams. It now has to do with the fact that the Brazilian women's team is really good. And so is the French women's team. And we're going to get a really good tournament watching those women play sports. And I think that's what I'm very proud of. I always get I'm proud to be American hat on. And I'm proud to be American. And so I think we've been down a lot of American identity lately, and I really think what makes this country a place that I'm always proud of when not here is things like Title IX, because I have women who come up to me, and I've had women come up to me and they say, I know you're American. And I'm okay, that's weird, but okay, let's continue the conversation. confident wherever you are. And I think that's what Title IX really gave to me as a person in the 90s, was like this moment where I was like, okay, I'm here, it's a big law firm, it's kind of law, okay, I'm ready, right? And I think of that as its most valuable sort of legacy.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank our panelists and moderator for this engaging and insightful conversation. I have two points, two takeaways. One, if you've not been to our women's basketball game. She has an incredible team, and if you haven't gone, go. If you don't have a season pass, get one. So that is my one takeaway. My second takeaway is this has really illuminated for me the critical importance of having a Title IX office on college campuses. And I know sometimes college campuses across the United States sometimes see this as a check the box. But what I'm learning is there are so many challenges that we face on college campuses, and the challenges are immense. And the experts who run these offices manage these challenges on behalf of the organization to advocate and take care of people when they really are at some of the lowest points of their lives. And so it's so critical that we support our Title IX office and also the Title IX experts that run those offices, because they're a critical piece to advancing women and advancing gender equality across campus. So with that, thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate you being here.